nation is deeply divided along so many lines, racially, politically, economically. Unbelievably, it's even possible that a twice impeached former president who's been indicted multiple times, including for trying to overturn his election defeat, actually could reach the presidency again. Hate among various groups has grown dramatically and is one of the many factors contributing to the mass shootings we're experiencing today. We're living in troubled times for our democracy, and that's our topic today. So stay with us.
Welcome to Lean to the Left, home of no-holds-barred commentary, plus interviews with fascinating people, some of them top experts, others simply with interesting stories to tell. You'll never know who'll show up at Lean to the Left. Now here's your host, Bob Gaddy.
Our guest today, Dr. Dick Simpson, has spent more than 5 decades as a legislator, campaign strategist, and government advisor, including serving as an alderman in the city of Chicago, a city known for hardball politics. We'll get his views on all of this. Dr. Simpson's the author of Democracy's Rebirth, The View from Chicago. With meticulous analysis and pragmatic recommendations, Dr. Simpson navigates the intricate web of political, racial, economic, and social disparities that are shaping our nation's destiny. The relevance of his work extends beyond a local context, making it a pivotal resource for anyone invested in the revitalization of democracy. Dr. Simpson, thanks for joining us today on the Lean to the Left podcast.
I'm delighted to do so, Bob.
Could you please provide us with a brief overview of Democracy's Rebirth, The View from Chicago, and the inspiration behind it?
As probably your listeners have intuited, there's been a decline in democracy worldwide. In 2020, 45 countries had lost ground towards autocracy instead of gaining ground towards democracy. And of course, we've seen that in the United States, particularly with the insurrection of January 2021, and with the ongoing crises, barely having a Congress that's functional today, and so many others. But I wanted to go beyond the headlines, and I wanted to do it in 2 ways. One, I wanted to look at the national crises, and there were a series of them: income and racial inequality, systemic racism, but corruption, low levels of participation in politics and government, the polarization, which has caused us to have a politics of resentment going on, and several others. And I wanted to also see how they played out at a local level. And I chose the city of Chicago because that's what I've known and written about for decades. Mm-hmm. And I found both happening. And I also then applied what have political scientists produced as alternatives to the various forms of democracy and the problems of democracy that we have. And so that's what put the book together.
So what aspects of Chicago's history and political landscape make it a pertinent case study for understanding the challenges of building a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy?
One way of putting it is that we're the epitome of Chicago politics, and is just like the national politics, but more like many parts of the country. We've had machine politics. We are the most segregated city in North America. We are the most corrupt metropolitan region in North America. So this makes it easy to look at the problem in its more extreme case, and to see how it affects us. I'll just give you one example. There are so many. The middle class in Chicago is shrinking like it is in the country. So back 30 years ago, 48% of all of our census tracts were middle class. Today, I think most people would be surprised to know only 16% are middle class. We have lost the middle class from Chicago. Jefferson and others thought if we didn't have a middle class, we wouldn't have a democracy. And that's one example how looking at why this happened in Chicago and what the arguments are nationally for restoring the middle class is worthwhile.
Your book delves into the complexities of money and politics. How has this issue contributed to the current democratic crisis?
One of the biggest political problems we have as a country is the corruption that comes from the wealthy and the corporations, both able to buy candidates in campaign contributions, but also to lobby. So for campaign contributions, what the wealthy give and the corporations give way outweigh the individual small donors and determine a number of the races. And obviously, congressmen or others who get elected from their money have to be responsive to their demands. In addition, in lobbying, I don't remember the exact figure from the book, but it's something like the business lobbyists are 16 times bigger than say, the labor or community group or the civic organization lobbies on Capitol Hill. And that's
Yeah.
true at the State House as well.
Okay. Money talks, BS walks, I guess is the way it is. Low voter participation is a concern across the nation. What are the underlying reasons for this trend, and how can we encourage greater engagement? After all, we're at a time when the safety and accuracy of our electoral process is being challenged by those who refuse to accept defeat.
Yes, we have a serious problem. Let me cover it in three ways. So first of all, I guess the good news is the voting level is going up. At my own university, we went from 42% of the students voting 54% in the next presidential election in 2016 to 67% in the last election in 2020. And the same was true in the off-year elections because we did a better job of civic engagement education than we had ever done in the history of our university. And that was happening throughout the country in many different ways. But two things drive the vote. One is that it has to be competitive. That is, when you have one party districts or one party states, there's no reason to turn out. You already know the outcome of the election. So if it's not competitive, it doesn't matter. Second thing is there has to be a difference. And for good or for bad, we have a lot of difference between the candidates and the parties at this point. But all of this is part of what I lead to in the last of the book, which is we need more than participation on election day. We need to revitalize our democracy in two fundamental ways, and we need a new movement to do it. The first way is more participation in local government. For instance, Chicago does not have neighborhood government. We have elected officials from neighborhoods, but we don't have any ability for citizens to weigh in on policy. Same thing as many suburbs are basically no longer participatory in their decision making about policies. So we have the examples like the New England Town Meeting and others. We know how to do it, but we're in need to build up a demand to do it. The second level for higher offices, a congressman now represents 750,000 people. They have no idea what those people really want or what their interests are. We've been doing experiments as political scientists where we got congressmen to meet with a representative sample from their district around a single issue like immigration. It could be any of the controversial issues of the day. And both the congressmen and the 100 citizens who participated in each of those sessions found them to be much more enlightening and useful than, say, the town hall meetings where everybody shouts at each other.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a minute ago the politics of resentment, which is discussed in your book. How has that played out in recent years, including among Donald Trump's MAGA supporters?
That's what is a fundamental difference. Even before Trump, we had states like Wisconsin where there was a division, and the people in small towns felt that the people in the big cities and the government weren't listening to their needs and their concerns. And so it began to be identity politics rather than issue politics. This is really magnified with the Trump supporters and the anti-Trump supporters. Often, particularly with the Trump supporters, they label anyone who's a liberal or anyone who holds different views, even within the Republican Party, even among other conservatives, as a traitor. We can't have politics where we're calling each other traitors. We have to have a politics that is at least civil enough for us to debate and deliberate in a meaningful fashion. And we have begun to head on a very deadly spiral that we have to correct. That's one of the reasons for suggesting more democracy, but under good guidelines that make it work functionally well and don't allow just yelling and screaming at each other.
And Dr. Simpson, is this recent episode with Republicans having such a hard time picking a speaker an illustration of what we're talking about here?
Yes, indeed. In fact, it's beginning to look like the Republican Party may in fact divide and split permanently. The last time we had that kind of change in the United States was in 1860, just before the Civil War, when the Whig Party went out of existence because they wouldn't deal with slavery, and the Republican Party came into existence. It is a time of too much polarization, and when you cannot even be considered a Main Street Republican conservative as being legitimate, then we have a real crisis on our hands, because you have a small minority that's becoming ever more autocratic and despotic and unwilling to participate in normal discourse in a democracy.
Yeah, it's very concerning. Now, political corruption is a recurring issue in the public eye. You're from a city that's known for political corruption over the years. How can we tackle this challenge to restore trust in our democratic institutions, Dr. Simpson?
It takes about 10 steps, but let me first lay the groundwork. In Illinois, since 1976, we've had more than 2,150 public officials go to federal prison for corruption. They've been tried in court.
Wow.
Over 1,800 of them come from the Chicago metropolitan area. We not only have corruption in the city council, where 37 have gone to prison and another 3 are currently on trial, but we also have corruption in all the branches of government, including the courts, over time. And we've had to try and begin to deal with it. One step we've taken as a state, besides just convicting people and sending them to jail, has been to pass a law requiring civic engagement education in the 8th grade and high school. We think in part that it's going to take a generation. We have to teach a new generation of students the cost of corruption, what the cause of corruption is, which is most often a kind of machine politics that makes it easy to do corruption as a side effect, and finally the cures for corruption, of which there are a number of individual steps, and it varies a little bit by state and city what kinds of laws have to pass, but in general we have to focus on corruption. Let me just give one other figure worldwide and Illinois. Worldwide, we lose $1 trillion a year to corruption. $1 trillion, not billion or not million. In Illinois alone, we pay $500 million more in tax for corruption. That's how much the corruption is costing us as a state every year. This is not a one-time cost.
Wow. Okay. Now, you said that structural problems are at the heart of our democracy struggles. What are some of the key structural issues that you see, and what practical steps can we take to address them?
So we take the example of the Electoral College. The Electoral College is non-democratic. It weights towards the smaller states and gives them more votes in the Electoral College. It also means that the popular vote and the Electoral College vote often don't match. It's been 5 times now that someone has been elected president but lost the majority vote of the country. And that's not healthy. So though some people talk about a constitutional amendment, and that would be fine, but difficult to do, we're on the verge of having states sign a contract, pass a law that if the majority of the states, or the states holding a majority of electoral votes, agree, they will give their electoral votes not proportionally according to how many votes they got in a state, but they will give their votes according to what the national vote is, which means it would be the same as if we were voting directly nationally. This would change it. It takes only about 4 more states to agree to the compact to have it come into effect. Often the structural problems have workarounds. Take the other example of the Senate filibuster, and for that matter, the hold that has been preventing the appointment of military officers and others. those are often not even rules. They're certainly not laws. They're not even rules, they're traditions in the body. You have the same thing in the House where they require that by practice now that a majority of the majority party congressmen must agree to move legislation forward. So if you come forward with gun control or climate change or some major controversial issue, the chances of getting, say, the Republicans, who are the majority currently, to have a majority who agree with that is almost nil. And therefore, legislation is being blocked, which the majority of both chambers favor but can't pass. Those are examples of structural problems. All of them have relatively straightforward, easy solutions and workarounds.
Do you feel that the Electoral College should be scrapped?
That's one alternative. I just think it's so hard to pass a constitutional amendment to do that, that it's better to go ahead and pass the legislation in each state that makes it possible for the majority vote to maintain. Yes, we could get rid of the Electoral College, but that would take either a constitutional convention or a constitutional amendment. And for practical reasons, that's not likely at the moment.
Yeah, what about the filibuster?
Filibuster could be stopped tomorrow morning. It takes a vote of the Senate itself.
Yeah, the likelihood of that is?
Well, it's going up because the Senate, while it's not as dysfunctional as the House, is significantly dysfunctional. The Senate itself is undemocratic. That is, the small states have more votes in the Senate than they ought to have in proportion to the size of the state. But that's a problem that would take a constitutional amendment or constitutional convention, and that would be very hard to achieve.
Yeah, okay. Now, you're all about inspiring individuals to contribute to the strengthening of democratic institutions. What role does education play in this process?
I think education is central, and we've been doing actually a lot about it. Let me just give you a few examples. I talked about the law we passed in Illinois and some other states.
Okay.
We have, the American Political Science Association, published now 4 books on how to teach civic engagement and practices that will engage students. They need to practice doing, not just listen to lectures. It's the short version of that. And there are plenty of ways to do that. So we've solved the intellectual or the practical problem like syllabi and those things. We just need to implement them. And as I mentioned, just on voting, once you implement them, there's a drastic change immediately in the outcome in terms of student participation. There are other things that we need to do. I think people are discouraged. They think their vote doesn't count. They think the government is run badly. They think every government official is a crook. It's not a simple one step to be able to do everything, but education is very important. There's one major bill that didn't get completely reintroduced in this Congress, but was introduced in the last 2, which is the Secure Democracies Act, which would make civic engagement education the equivalent of STEM education, a priority in education, and would provide $1 billion from the federal government to launch that program. That ought to be a high priority after the 2024 election.
Now, with your experience as a former alderman in a city with a long history of political corruption and as a political scientist, how can we create lasting positive change in our communities?
One of the first things that's happened in Chicago is through lawsuits, we have eliminated political patronage. That is, I can't appoint you to a city job just because you worked in my election, and I can't fire you if you gave a campaign contribution to my opponent. That's now the law of the land. It's been up to the Supreme Court several times. Corruption has become, in fact, unconstitutional, but there is a problem. When the Supreme Court has decided the recent cases on corruption, they've narrowed the definition of corruption to a direct quid pro quo. That is, just because you gave me a campaign contribution, it's not corrupt. Only if you gave me a campaign contribution with the promise that I would back Law 2703 is it a corruption act. That's way too narrow to be able to effectively deal by law with corruption. There are other steps we can do. For instance, in Chicago, We have, by executive order and now by ordinance, taken away what was known as aldermanic privilege. That's when the city council person got to tell the administrative agent, don't give them a driveway permit, don't give them an awning, don't give them, bring some building inspectors and close them down. The aldermen were too powerful, and then they used that to get bribes from the businesses, mostly in their local community.
You served as an alderman when?
I served for 8 years, from 1971 to 1979. I led the opposition bloc against Mayor Richard J. Daley and his successor, Mayor Michael Balandic.
That must have been an interesting 8 years that you spent.
It was a very interesting 8 years. It did give me an insight to politics and real politics that has been invaluable and helpful, I think.
Okay. Now, in her foreword to your book, Chicago Mayor Lori E. Lightfoot writes, democracy is an argument that says that our society's greatest success comes by all of its members having an equal opportunity to unlock their shared talent and potential. Can you comment about that?
Yes, we've known since Athenian democracy 2,500 years ago that when you unleash the power of the public, that each individual can aspire to whatever point they want, and each can have a voice in shaping the policies of the government, that there are enormous advances. And some of the advances in the United States have happened as we've become more democratic over the years. Originally, women couldn't vote. Originally, African Americans couldn't vote. And so with many minorities and others, American Indians certainly, as we've unleashed the power of more and more of our population, we've made greater and greater gains. The danger now is we tend to be moving in the other direction. For instance, you mentioned Mr. Trump. If he were to become president, we might well spiral into an autocracy.
Yes, that is a very scary idea and a very scary likelihood. And it's hard to understand how people can't see that. But I guess that's where we are.
I have great confidence in the next election, but it only holds true if everyone turns out. And in the long term, even winning the election and making sure that we don't move more autocratically is not enough. We have to redesign our democracy to have more participatory democracy at the local level and more deliberative democracy at the higher levels. And that's doable, but it's not doable without the public demanding it.
Do you have any stories you'd like to share with us from the time that you were an alderman working with the administration of Mayor Daley?
The biggest clash we had was right after I became alderman in 71. That July, the mayor appointed a man named Tom Keene Jr., put before the council the appointment of Tom Keene Jr. to the Zoning Board of Appeals, local body. This decides on the zoning for properties. And the problem with that was twofold. One, he was the son of the most powerful member of the city council, Tom Keene Sr. And secondly, that is, it's nepotism, that if your name is Gotti, you can't be in an important position. If your name is Keene or Daley, you can be. Mm-hmm. That means most of us are cut out from politics and government. The second problem was it turned out that Tom Keene Jr. was also the vice president of Arthur Rubloff Company, which was the biggest developer and real estate agent in Chicago at the time. So it was a conflict of interest in two directions. Right. And I stood up to oppose it. The Mayor Daley had the longest tirade that he had in his mayoral career in the city council. And we lost that vote. The vote was 48-2. Wow. But over time, we've been able to break much of the machine and to establish a better democracy and to elect people like Lori Lightfoot or the current mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson.
Are you still involved politically at all in Chicago?
I have through the last election, and I still support some congressional candidates and others around the country.
Okay. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I hope people will begin to take seriously these multiple problems, these cascading crises that we face, but have a sense of hope. The reason the book is titled Democracy's Rebirth is it is not just doom and gloom. It suggests there is a way forward, and it's one that we can take together.
All right, that's a hopeful comment. Where can people find your books, Dr. Simpson, and how can they reach out to you if they want to?
So the book was published by the University of Illinois Press, but it's available in an ebook form. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any of the sites that people normally shop for books. Local bookstore can easily order it. And it's a paperback, so it's relatively inexpensive.
Okay.
If people want to reach me, the best way is by email. My email is simpson@u.edu.
That's UIC, correct?
University of Illinois, Chicago.
Okay, great. All right, Dr. Simpson, thank you so much. It's been great talking with you, and I appreciate you joining us on the Lean to the Left podcast.
My pleasure. Hope to see you again soon.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this Lean to the Left video and that you learned something as well. Please come back on a regular basis and check out our interviews with guests on topics that I hope you find interesting, entertaining, and enlightening. And you can check out the schedule of upcoming shows, guests, and topics at podcast.leantotheleft.net. You can also subscribe to our audio version there or to our video shows here at YouTube. And follow us on social media. Facebook at the Lean to the Left podcast, Twitter at Lean to the Left 1, Instagram at BobGaddy_Lean to the Left, and TikTok at Lean to the Left. Our goal is to be informative and entertaining as we and our guests comment on the latest developments in the news and about the social issues that concern us all. This is Bob Gaddy signing off for Lean to the Left. Thanks for sharing your time with us.